And I think the arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I've said to Sam Harris, and I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
I have no idea what type of mental gymnastics this is, but there is no argument against atheism, Ben. The only argument, to put it like that, against atheism is proving God is real. That's it. Merry Christmas, everyone. First and foremost, what a great time to discuss something easy and relaxing like free will and morality, am I right? Today's video is about a debate between Alex O'Connor, which you may know as Cosmic Skeptic, and Ben Shapiro, which you may know as exactly that. The tag is religion good or bad for society? And I think it's fairly obvious that no consensus is reached, as is the case with most debates. The two parties retain the ideological positions they come in with because that's how humans function after all. It takes time for us to change our world-defining views, and I would say most people never do. But beyond that, this is an interesting talk, and I wanted to address it because I think mistakes are being made. So let's get into that, shall we? I'll separate the video into two parts because there are two overarching subjects that are being discussed: free will and morality. Let's get it moving.
Could you sort of concisely, if you can, talk about what you mean by the atheist delusion?
Sure. So I should start off by saying I don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God. I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another. And so I'm not going to try and do that with Alex today, because I think that if people would have been able to provide dispositive proofs, then people would believe them. And if people were able to provide dispositive proofs that God does not exist, then people would be more apt to believe those as well.
I think Ben makes three crucial mistakes here. The first one is a false dichotomy. The atheist position is based on the null hypothesis, which in layman's terms translates to there's no connection between God and existence until proven as such. In even clearer terms, I do not accept that God is real until proven he is. Which isn't the same as stating God is not real, in which case the one making the claim would have the burden of proof. Atheists don't. At least not weak atheists who abide by what atheism is, which is the lack of belief in a God. So Ben saying you can neither prove nor disprove God is him trying to level the playing field and misrepresent his opponent's position, saying I can't prove God, but you cannot disprove him either. Except atheism isn't required to disprove God, because atheism doesn't claim that God doesn't exist. Only one party has the burden of proof, and that's Ben's. The second mistake is that Ben believes that proving God's existence isn't necessary, yet it is. It is necessary if you want Alex to accept he exists, and you want Alex to accept he exists if you want him to consider your moral system as intrinsically necessary or superior. Consider this point. You won't accept my moral system no matter how I define it, simply because I claim it is the will of the flying spaghetti monster. You don't believe that the flying spaghetti monster is real, and until I can prove he is, all I am is just a guy saying stuff. The same applies to you. Until you can prove God is real and he's the ultimate lawgiver from which our moral system erupts, you're just a guy saying stuff. And you cannot appeal to the God is necessary argument because you just said
Don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God. I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another.
So, in your own words, it doesn't matter how logical your line of reasoning is or how clear you postulate the necessity of God's existence. You need to actually prove God's existence with clear evidence which go beyond logical argumentation. The third mistake is that Ben misconstrues his actual stance. What's the point of saying, I don't think you can prove that God exists so long as you believe he does, and base your entire moral system on that belief, and you want people to adopt your said moral system? Your entire position is based on God being real, otherwise your moral foundation would collapse. I would argue it already collapses since you've admitted you cannot prove God exists, but that's for another time. The main point is the fault of claiming that your moral system is superior and true while simultaneously admitting that you cannot demonstrate its foundation as real. The following segment addresses free will and how Alex and Ben define it. As you'll see, they're not that far apart.
I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will.
The good of religion to society, one of those goods is people believing that their free will matters, and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to. So
Just to be clear, Alex and Ben only disagree on form, not substance. When Alex says that we don't have free will, he's referring to we cannot will what we will. In other words, we do what we want to do, but we can't want what we want to do. We can only control how we act on our desires, urges, and wants, but we cannot control those desires, urges, and wants to begin with. We cannot produce them by sheer will. Those appear to be the result of genetics and environment. You drink water because you're thirsty, but you cannot decide when to be thirsty. You eat chocolate because you like it, but you cannot decide to like chocolate, you just do. You can also refuse to eat chocolate despite liking it and wanting to eat it. But the reason why you refuse to eat it is also out of your control. Like, say you want to avoid it to lose weight. In that context, losing weight is more important to you, but you didn't decide consciously that it's more important to you. It just is, and you chose to act in that regard. So, in this sense, we truly don't have free will. Alex is correct. When it comes to Ben, he defines free will in more of a pragmatic way. His definition falls more in line with, I thought about doing something and I did it. This simple act of acting or not on your thoughts and wants is evidence enough that free will exists. Ben acknowledges Alex's definition and he agrees that we don't have free will in that sense, but he doesn't care because
I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to.
Alex himself agrees with this point, as he admits that the illusion of free will is not only necessary for a functional society, but inescapable, because even if you're aware of it, you still continue to function as if you're not.
I will say that the mechanism is so useful and has been so successful in embedding itself into our psyche that we cannot shake it off. So I can I can have conversations with people, as I do regularly, talking about the existence of free will, and they come away saying, you know what, that's extraordinary, maybe you're right about this. And nothing about the way they live their lives changes, precisely because of the fact that the very argument I'm making relies on the assumption that we will still be driven by our drives.
So they don't really disagree on this topic. The only difference is that when it comes to the pragmatic view on free will, Alex thinks it's just an illusion, a powerful one that drives the way we think and act, but an illusion either way, while Ben believes it's the actual manifestation of genuine free will. Like I said, it's a disagreement on nuance and form, not actual substance. But then we get to the crux of it.
The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle, or not so subtle, implication in my view that yes, with no God there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God. And that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
The main point is the fault of claiming that your moral system is superior and true, while simultaneously admitting that you cannot demonstrate its foundation as real. Yes, exactly. So how will Ben get out of this pickle? Well, like so.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now you can call that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will.
Yeah, he doesn't really get out of any pickle, does he? You see, Ben, you're not just sanding off the edges, and you're not only arguing for something extra natural. You're an Ashkenazi Jew, so you're actually arguing for a specific God with a specific profile and requirements, a specific lawgiver. I can't just call that God or not God. I also can't call it any God. I need to call it your God if I am to accept your value system, because your value system is based on a specific entity. So let's not play word games just so you can dodge the very legitimate trap that Alex set in place. I also found the next segment very relevant, as it offers us a glimpse into Ben's reasoning process.
Again, the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision making, and you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
Uncaused decision making, I suppose, is a concept that I think is unintelligible.
So?
An uncaused decision. I mean, what is the process by which a decision is made?
But now you're falling into the same sort of argument that I excluded at the beginning, which was I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand. So I can't explain to you how the uncaused self makes decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
But you have a
framework.
burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And so if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said at the very beginning, that leaves me a giant escape hatch. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch. It also tends to act as a fundamental principle of faith, right? Again, in every moral realm, right? When we get to the problem of good and evil, right? One of the big questions is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's.
What Ben is doing here by mentioning the escape hatch is effectively creating an unfalsifiable system. His position is that if something doesn't make sense in his system, then it's his fault for not understanding how the system works. The possibility that there's something wrong with the system itself isn't even there. If there's something about what God is or does that doesn't make sense or seems illogical or paradoxical, then you, the reasoning agent, are at fault due to your limitations. It can't be that the notion itself of God could be at fault. This optics simply renders his religious system as unfalsifiable, because it doesn't matter how many inaccuracies, contradictions, and even paradoxes you could throw at Ben, he can easily dismiss them via. The obvious problem is that this is only an escape hatch for Ben, allowing him to preserve his faith by means of self-deception. But for the rest of us, it's actually a symptom of intellectual dishonesty and self-delusion. This point aside, remember when I mentioned the null hypothesis? This is why. Ben claims that Alex has the burden of proof for saying that the materialistic universe is the cause of all, while he who postulates the existence of an entire realm outside of the observable universe does not. It's actually mind-blowing to me that someone can casually throw such a preposterous claim with a straight face. In reality, it works precisely the other way around, and we'll use the null hypothesis again to
kind of sand off the rough edges there.
There is no relationship between existence and Ben's imaginary realm until proven as such. I mean, think about it. If Ben, who postulates something outside of the observable universe, doesn't have the burden of proof, then no one who does that has. By extension, all religious and faith-based systems, no matter how absurd and paradoxical, should be considered as real, and you who don't accept their existence would have to disprove them. Because when questioned about the absurdity and paradoxical features of their universe, one could simply say,
the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand.
There's a reason why we have the concept of the burden of proof and why the null hypothesis is such a landmark in epistemology, so we won't end up like Ben. An important note here, Alex would have had the burden of proof if he claimed the materialistic universe is responsible for all that exists, because this claim eliminates the possibility that something else outside of the materialistic universe is responsible for all that exists, which would imply that Alex has absolute knowledge. So he cannot claim that without also dragging the burden of proof on his side. Instead, Alex's position is essentially Ben's claim that there is another realm beyond the materialistic universe has not met its burden of proof, so I cannot accept it as true.
I don't think the burden is on me there. I think you were the one who was making the claim that free will does exist, that there is this mysterious property of the universe.
Actually, that's not true.
escape.
The actual claim that I originally made, if you recall, was a conditional claim. I did not claim free will exists, therefore God. I claimed if you believe free will exists, it cannot exist in a materialist universe. Now,
Ben is correct here. He did not claim that free will exists, therefore God. But do you notice the dodge and the reframing? What Ben actually believes is God exists, therefore free will. But he doesn't say that. His opposing claim to free will exists, therefore God is if you believe free will exists, it cannot exist in the materialist universe. He removed the concept of God from the statement entirely. In reality, the opposing claim is God exists, therefore free will, which is exactly what he believes anyway. But he can't state this clearly because he's just admitted that he cannot prove God exists. By extension, this means he cannot prove free will exists because the existence of God necessarily postulates the existence of free will in his system.
There are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me. Because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe.
Is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you, being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you? Or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? The question of utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call it something else.
See, what Ben is doing here is assume that someone who tries to kill someone else because God told him so is either delusional or a liar, following his own self-interests. These are the only two possible explanations, and they make up for quite a savory false dichotomy, setting the stage for an awesome dish of no true Scotsman fallacy. He eliminates the possibility God actually told him to execute the murder. But why isn't that possible, Ben? Oh, it's because there's no way God would allow murder? And how exactly did you determine that? After all, your mind is not God's, right?
When we get to the problem of good and evil, right, one of the big questions is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's.
So Ben can claim that his mind is not God's when confronted with relatively mild ideological questions, but his mind suddenly is God's when the context is more serious and has direct real-world consequences, because he can't really allow the idea of using his religion or image of God to do or promote evil. It's an escape hatch, remember? Also, keep in mind the concept of moral absolutes and universal values that Ben mentions here.
I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable.
It'll come into play shortly.
That's an interesting indictment on the position that theists don't say that atheists can't be moral, right? When people have this argument about morality,
Atheists can certainly be moral.
well, oftentimes people have this misunderstanding of the argument. Christopher Hitchens did it best in saying, we don't need divine permission to be good and all of this. Fine, but as you say, you don't need to believe in God to be good, but you need to believe in God to ground that goodness. But then when you sort of casually throw in this statement by Voltaire, I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does. That implies that actually maybe you do think that without the belief in God, somebody isn't going to
No, I think that Voltaire thought that he was good, meaning that Voltaire was an atheist and thought that he was good. But his point was sort of back to the Straussian Platonic point.
His point was that he hoped his maid believed in God because without that belief, she wouldn't be able to act morally.
Right. So another, because again, when we're arguing on the basis of broad societal utility, one of the things, so I happen to be in the happy position of being able to argue that what I think is socially useful also happens to be true.
It seems like Ben is actually using social usefulness or utility as the foundation of his moral system, not God and not religion. He seems to only use the idea of God and religion to imbue his moral system with a sense of irrefutable authority in a way that the human law system cannot fulfill, because you cannot escape God's justice, right? But in reality, God isn't the foundation of Ben's moral system, utility is. It was actually very interesting for me to observe this, because I also believe social utility is the best foundation for morality one can have. With the mention that the topic is far more complex than that, as you need to discuss the balance between social utility and individual freedom, among other things. Such a topic deserves a separate video, or even a series of videos, which I might actually consider at some point. By the way, here's another instance to illustrate this point.
Yeah, what do you think quickly about that? When we're talking about religion, do we need to be more semantically sort of accurate?
Rigorous, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, again, I'm not here to defend every form of religion under the sun. There are various forms of religion, ranging from things that people in Judeo-Christian tradition would consider pagan, to Judeo-Christian monotheism, to the distinctions in Judaism and Christianity, which are substantial, obviously. And so, I do believe that there are right forms of religion or righter forms of religion than others. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be a particularist in my religious practice or my religious belief. And one thing that I tend not to do as a religious believer is simply take people's texts at sort of face value. I tend to actually judge faith by faith practice. I will say that the value of religion more generally, the social cohesion point would be the best case in favor of religion, is that virtually every study ever done has shown that social cohesion relies on a common orientation among people in order to build commonality between people. There are really only a few structures in human history that do that. One is a kinship structure. The problem with kinship and tribal structures is that they pretty quickly devolve into tribal warfare upon other members of different tribes. One of the things that religion has done is an attempt to universalize that beyond the immediate sort of tribal self-interest that we discussed a little bit ago.
You see what I mean? Ben compares between religions based on their social effects and how useful they are in practice. It doesn't matter much what a given religion demands, it only matters the social effect that would transpire if those demands were met, and how a religion looks like in practice rather than theory. Which is why he mentioned the idea of kinship, which failed because it led to social unrest and warfare. This is even more evidence that what Ben is actually valuing here is social utility, where some of the goals he's pursuing are social cohesion, stability, security, you name it. And he declares a given moral value as moral or immoral based on how it affects these goals either immediately or in the long run. Funny enough, there's no need for God in this system. If your entire system assesses the moral worth of a value or action based on its effects on the individual and more largely society as a whole with respect to a specific set of goals, God isn't necessary. You can argue it's only necessary as a compulsory agent, but not as a lawgiver. You're making the laws yourself.
Do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God commanding something which you now see to be, or rather permitting something and explicitly and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
Because he's not permitting me, permitting my great to
do something immoral.
To do something
immoral.
That in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
right.
But was it immoral?
By today's standards that were developed by the
relativist?
Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral. Which, by the way, you're living.
In my view, this is the nail in the coffin for Ben's moral system. Let me remind you what he said approximately 30 minutes earlier into the interview.
The utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interest and to say, here are things that I cannot do, even if they are in my interest, because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable, it reduces things that we all take for granted.
So let's understand the terms Ben is using here. The notion of moral absolutes refers to moral values that are either right or wrong, no matter the context or circumstance. They just are how they are and do not change. Universally applicable means that they apply to all humans in all times and all places. This qualifies said moral values not only as facts, but as immutable facts, which is why Alex insisted with
To do something immoral.
To do something.
To do
that
something
in the ti-
immoral.
That in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
Right.
but was it immoral? Now,
Alex's main point of contention here is that prior to slavery, Ben basically said that morality doesn't care how people view it. God-imbued moral decrees are absolute and universal. But when it came to slavery, Ben no longer considers the God-imbued moral decree that endorsed the practice as absolute and universal. Rather, it only mattered how people view it then compared to now, which is an obvious sign of cognitive dissonance. Here's one final point to illustrate Ben's inability to reconcile his intellectual contradiction.
it wasn't considered immoral,
Right.
but was it immoral? Now,
And by today's standards, by today's standards
who's
that
the
were
moral
developed by the
relativist?
Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral.
So
Which, by
wh-
the way, you're living off the you're again, not to get back to the Tom Holland argument, you're living off the remains of this. I mean, where's
Which
your
is what you
morality
think,
coming from?
But who's the moral relativist now? I mean, it seems that a moment ago you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be bad now by the progress of Judeo-Christian
there's a question
values.
of
Who's the moral relativist?
Well, it's not relativistic to say that a thing that is wrong today is considered wrong today because of a tradition that developed over time.
The question
Actually, yeah, it is. Your moral system is either absolute and universal, or it is not. The definition of moral relativism even excludes the terms absolute and universal, and details the to each her own feature which Ben has used almost explicitly when stating that slavery was considered moral by the people of that time, and who is he to judge them using today's moral standards. To be clear, Ben isn't defending the people of the time here because he doesn't shy away from denouncing immoralities performed in the name of his religion. Rather, he's defending the Bible because the Bible is pretty much the foundation of his moral system, and if that fails, he has nothing else to work with. I would argue he does, because he already identified social utility as the most important tool for measuring morality. But it's quite obvious why he can't settle for that alone. He needs to insert God somewhere in that system as well, even if it's not necessary. So his entire moral foundation rests on his ability to find shades of color in a clear black and white situation such as slavery. I think that, free will aside, the real point of contention is morality and using God as the foundation of one's value system. My position is that Ben lost not only the debate, but the race for truth as well. To summarize, he believes that his religious morality is superior to all morality systems because it produces positive and measurable individual and social effects. This reasoning renders God useless. He argues that under his religious system, morality is absolute and universal, but he becomes a moral relativist when confronted with the problem of slavery. He argues that his morality is superior, absolute, and universal because it comes from God, but he states that he cannot prove God exists. To throw my 2 cents in, I believe Ben should embrace moral realism instead because, effectively, that's what he's arguing for. He's arguing that there are moral facts about the world that we can discover and that these are separate from people's opinions. His only problem is that instead of proclaiming those moral facts as objective and justifying them by appealing to social utility, which he already does by the way, he goes one step further and categorizes them as absolute and universal, so he can root them in God and religion, which is, in my opinion, an unsustainable position. Look at where this strategy got him when it came to slavery. So yeah, this is what I got for you today. If you appreciate the content, hit the like, subscribe, and consider maybe even becoming a Patreon member. And oh yeah, stay tuned for part 2. It's coming.